They had just taken everything from her, not quietly, not privately, publicly, under the chandeliers, in the center of the ballroom, with every guest close enough to witness it. Her father's will had been read aloud only moments before. If she did not marry within 30 days, she would inherit nothing. No estate, no fortune, no protection. And the room had already decided what would happen next. I am Edmund Varcourt, Duke of Ashenmere, and I have seen many reputations collapse in silence. This was worse. This was expectation. Her aunts watched her as one watches a problem finally reaching its conclusion. Gentlemen who had ignored her for years now measured her with sudden, calculated interest. Even the solicitor spoke as though the matter were already settled. She would choose, she would comply, she would survive, but not with dignity. She stood in the center of it all, still, composed, yet not untouched. I noticed it, the slight tension in her hand, the way her breath stilled just a fraction too long. Not panic, control, as if she were holding something together or holding something back. She should have accepted, should have lowered her gaze, should have done what every woman in that position had always done. Instead, she looked up, not at her family, not at the men waiting, at the room itself. And something shifted, because there was no desperation in her expression, only awareness. Then she moved, and the ballroom fell silent. She walked past every man who suddenly wanted her, and stopped in front of me. A mistake, I thought. Everyone knew I despised her family. She knew it too. They expect me to choose quickly, she said softly. I did not answer. Something was wrong. Then she added, so I will choose the one man who cannot be used against me. The murmur was immediate, sharp, dangerous, because in that moment, she had not accepted her fate, she had changed it, and somehow, she had chosen me. But what unsettled me most was not her decision. It was the certainty behind it, as though this had never been a risk, only a step, which left one question I could not ignore. What had she already set in motion, before any of us realized we were part of it? If you had been there, would you have trusted her? To understand why her choice unsettled me, you must first understand what everyone believed about her, and more importantly, what they preferred to believe. Miss Eleanor Halvern had never been remarkable. That was the version of her most convenient to society. Not scandalous enough to fear, not charming enough to pursue, not beautiful enough to threaten. She existed in that quiet, dismissible space reserved for women who were expected to marry eventually, and yet somehow never did. Her father, Lord Halvern, was a man of rigid pride and even more rigid expectations. His estate was old, his influence considerable, and his patience selective. He had 3 daughters. The first married well, the second married strategically, the third remained. Eleanor was always presented last in any introduction, as though she were an afterthought politely included to maintain appearances. At dinners, she spoke only when addressed. At balls, she danced only when asked, and she was not often asked. It became a pattern, a quiet one, the kind that settles so deeply into society that no one thinks to question it, least of all me. My distaste for the Halvern name was neither subtle nor unfounded. Years ago, Lord Halvern had aligned himself against my interests in a matter of land, petty, political, and resolved only through the sort of negotiation that leaves neither side inclined toward forgiveness. I had no interest in his daughters, and even less in the smallest, quietest one. If anything, Eleanor Halvern represented precisely the kind of social arrangement I avoided: predictable, unremarkable, safe. And yet, there were moments, small enough to be dismissed, but persistent enough to linger, when that illusion did not hold. I remember a dinner at Carenhollow Manor. She had been seated far from the centre, placed between a distant cousin and a man who had already begun drinking before the second course. No one expected her to contribute, no one encouraged it. But when the conversation turned, briefly, to estate management, I noticed something. She did not speak. She did not interrupt. But she listened. Not passively, precisely. Her attention did not wander as others did. Her gaze did not follow laughter or spectacle. It fixed, quietly, on the man speaking. And when he misstated a figure, she did something curious. Nothing. No correction. No reaction. but her expression shifted. Just slightly, as though she had filed the error away for future use. At the time, I dismissed it, because that is what one does with small inconsistencies. One explains them away. One returns to the narrative that is easier to maintain, and the narrative was simple. She was overlooked because there was nothing to see. That was what society agreed upon. That was what her own family reinforced. Even Lord Halvern, in his final months, rarely mentioned her except in terms of obligation. The will itself reflected that same cold logic. Not a gift, not an inheritance freely given, a condition, a deadline, a test. Marry within 30 days, or be erased from the legacy entirely. It was, in many ways, a final act of control, and everyone in that ballroom believed it would work, that she would panic, that she would accept the first acceptable offer, that she would finally become useful in the only way society had ever expected her to be. But what unsettled me, what refused to settle neatly into that illusion, was not her refusal. It was the absence of surprise in her eyes, as though the will had not trapped her, as though it had merely revealed something already in motion. And I began to wonder, had she truly been overlooked all these years? Or had we simply been watching the wrong things? The first fracture did not come from what she did. It came from what began to go wrong around her. In the days following the will, the house did not quiet, it sharpened. Visitors arrived earlier, stayed longer, spoke more carefully, and beneath it all there was something new. Not curiosity, not opportunity, unease, because she did not behave as she should have. By the 5th day, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Men came prepared to negotiate. They left uncertain, not rejected in any way that could be repeated, not dismissed in any way that could be explained, but altered. I saw it in their expressions as they stepped back into their carriages, not insulted, not triumphant, unsettled, as though the conversation had not gone in the direction they expected, and worse, they could not quite explain why. That alone would have been unusual. But it did not stop there. She did not retreat from society. She increased her presence within it, deliberately. She attended every gathering where her situation might be discussed, placed herself where she could be observed, listened without interruption, and allowed others to define her incorrectly. That was the first mistake most made. They believed her silence was uncertainty. It was not. It was permission. I began to test it. At Lady Fenwick's musicale, I allowed a name to surface, carelessly, as though it held no weight, a gentleman with sufficient influence to secure her future, a safe choice, a predictable one. The reaction was immediate, not from her, from the room, because someone across the floor shifted, too quickly, too sharply, a man who had not been part of the conversation, who had not been addressed, and yet had been listening. That was the moment I stopped watching her alone, and began watching what reacted to her. The pattern emerged quickly. Conversations changed when she entered, not abruptly, but subtly enough that only those looking for it would notice. Certain names were no longer spoken with confidence, certain alliances were discussed with care, certain assumptions were no longer made at all. And still, she said nothing. At dinner 2 nights later, the tension finally surfaced. Her aunt, impatient, calculating, forced the matter into the open. "You cannot afford to hesitate any longer, Eleanor." A statement, public, irrevocable. Every guest understood what had just occurred. This was no longer concern. It was pressure, social, deliberate, and designed to force compliance. The table stilled. All attention shifted to her. This was the moment. Acceptance, or humiliation. She lifted her glass, took a measured sip, set it down with care. "I am not hesitating," she said. Her tone was calm, too calm. "I am waiting." The effect was immediate, not loud, but undeniable, because she had done something dangerous. She had removed urgency from the equation, and without urgency, the entire structure of the will began to weaken. I watched the reactions carefully, because this time they did not belong to her. A gentleman at the far end of the table avoided her gaze entirely. Another, who had been most eager only days before, fell uncharacteristically silent. And then, Lord Everden. Until that moment, he had remained precisely what he intended to be: uninvolved, peripheral, a man too composed to appear interested, too distant to invite suspicion. But when she spoke, he looked at her, not with curiosity, not with calculation, with recognition, and something else, something far more revealing, concern. It lasted only a second, but it was enough, because men like Lord Everden do not concern themselves with outcomes they do not control, which meant this was not unfolding as he expected, and suddenly the illusion fractured completely. She was not navigating the situation, she was shaping it, allowing certain pressures to build, allowing certain people to step forward, allowing others to reveal themselves. And in that moment, one truth settled into place with unsettling clarity. The will had not created the problem, it had exposed it, which meant her choice in that ballroom had never been desperate, it had been timed, and whatever she was waiting for had not yet fully surfaced. The moment I chose to act, I did not approach her. I approached her silence, because by then it had become clear that whatever she intended, it was not contained in what she said, it was hidden in what she allowed others to believe. I began, as I always do, with what could be verified: the will. Lord Halvern had dictated it in the final weeks of his life, when his health had already begun to fail in ways polite society preferred not to discuss. The language was precise, unforgiving: 30 days, a legally binding marriage, or complete forfeiture. At first glance it appeared simple. A man forcing control beyond the grave, a daughter cornered into obedience. But the more I examined it, the more something resisted that interpretation, because the condition was not merely restrictive, it was exposed, too visible, too easily discussed, too perfectly suited to become the center of public attention. And Lord Halvern was not a man who invited attention unless it served a purpose, which meant the will was not only a trap, it was a stage. That realization alone would have been enough to unsettle me. But it was not the only inconsistency. There were letters, not hidden, not locked away, simply unremarked. Correspondence sent in the weeks before his death, to solicitors, to minor estates, to individuals with no obvious connection to his family. Most would have dismissed them as routine. I did not, because their timing did not align with a man preparing to relinquish control. They aligned with someone rearranging it, carefully, quietly, deliberately. And at the center of all of it, her, not mentioned directly, never named in a way that would draw attention, but present, in the decisions, in the redirections, in the subtle transfers of influence that only someone deeply familiar with the structure of his estate would recognize. Which left me with a conclusion I did not immediately trust. Eleanor Halvern had known, not merely about the will, but about what came before it. She had not been surprised because there had been nothing to surprise her, and that meant the version of her that society had accepted for years was incomplete by design. I chose then to test it, carefully, indirectly. At Lady Ashbourne's dinner, I allowed the conversation to drift, as it inevitably did, toward inheritance, toward conditions, toward the various ways in which men attempted to govern their legacies beyond death. And when the moment came, I spoke, casually, as though the thought had only just occurred to me. Such conditions often reveal more about the living than the dead. A simple observation, harmless, open to interpretation. The room responded as expected, polite agreement, measured interest. But she did not respond at all, not immediately. She allowed the silence to pass, allowed others to speak, allowed the conversation to settle, and only then, without turning toward me, without altering her posture, she said, "Only when one assumes the condition was created for the purpose it appears to serve." The table stilled, subtly but completely, because what she had done was shift the premise, not reject it, not contradict it, but undermine it, and in doing so, she had confirmed something without ever stating it. She did not believe the will was what it seemed, which meant she knew something the rest of us did not. I met her gaze then, directly, for the first time since the ballroom, and she did not look away. There was no challenge in her expression, no invitation, no fear, only that same controlled awareness. as though she had been waiting for this precise moment. Not for me to confront her, but for me to understand enough to stop asking the wrong questions. And that was when the realization became unavoidable. The will was not the beginning of this situation. It was the visible edge of something far more carefully constructed, something that had been in motion long before Lord Halvern's death, long before the ballroom, long before she had spoken my name, which meant her choice of me was not merely strategic, it was necessary. And if that was true, then the question was no longer what she was hiding. It was, what exactly had she positioned me to become part of? If you find yourself tracing these threads as I did, I would be curious to know, what role would you have assumed in my place? I decided then that observation alone would no longer suffice. If Eleanor Halvern had constructed something beneath the surface of society, then the only way to understand it was to step inside it. Deliberately. Publicly. On my terms. The next invitation I accepted was not accidental. Lady Norbury's autumn dinner was precisely the kind of gathering where reputations were not merely discussed, they were negotiated. Influence sat at that table, quietly, dangerously, and I ensured my arrival was noted, not through announcement, through timing, late enough to draw attention, early enough to control it. She was already there, of course she was, seated where she could be seen, but not where she could be cornered. I did not approach her, not yet. Instead, I allowed the evening to unfold, as it always did. Conversation, speculation, subtle positioning disguised as civility. Her situation remained the centerpiece, though no one dared address it directly in her presence. They spoke around her, about timelines, about opportunity, about the inevitability of resolution. She listened, as always. But now I watched differently. Because I was no longer observing her reactions, I was observing her influence. And it was there, not in what she said, but in what others began to avoid saying. Names once mentioned confidently were now introduced with hesitation. Assumptions once stated as certainty were now framed as possibility. She had not corrected a single narrative, and yet she had altered all of them. That was when I intervened, not abruptly, not conspicuously, but with precision. I allowed the conversation to shift, gradually, toward contractual marriages, toward the mechanics of alliance, toward the advantages of time pressure. And then, as though offering nothing more than idle thought, I said, urgency, when imposed, often benefits someone other than the one being hurried. A pause followed, small but deliberate, the kind that invites interpretation, that invites alignment, and then, predictably, others joined in, questioning the structure, speculating on the intent, examining the will not as obligation, but as design. I did not look at her, I did not need to, because I could feel the shift, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. The narrative was no longer stable, and that was the first fracture I had chosen to create. But it was not enough, because whatever she had set in motion required more than disruption. It required exposure, and for that I needed confirmation, not from documents, not from speculation, from her. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following evening, at a smaller gathering, more private but no less strategic, I ensured we were left momentarily without interruption, not alone, never entirely, but unobserved enough for truth to surface, if it intended to. You anticipated the will. I did not phrase it as a question. She did not treat it as one. Yes, no hesitation, no deflection, no performance. The simplicity of the answer was more revealing than any explanation. You allowed the narrative to form. Yes, again, unmoved, unapologetic, and you chose me before that night. This time she studied me, not cautiously, but with the same measured awareness I had come to recognize as her most consistent trait. I chose the only man who would not misinterpret what was happening. It was not flattery, it was assessment, which made it far more dangerous. "And what," I asked, "is happening?" A silence followed, not empty, weighted, calculated, because for the first time she did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter, not uncertain, but precise. "My father's will does not determine my future." A statement, not an argument. It reveals who has already attempted to. The implication settled slowly, but when it did, it altered everything. Because this was no longer a matter of inheritance, or marriage, or social pressure. This was control, contested, hidden, and already in motion. Then, the 30 days are not a deadline, she said. They are a limit, a boundary, a containment, a structure designed not to force her into action, but to force something else into visibility. And suddenly, the final piece began to align. She had not been avoiding decisions, she had been narrowing them, allowing the right pressures to build, allowing the right individuals to reveal themselves, allowing the illusion of urgency to draw out intention. And I had been placed within that structure, not as an escape, but as a variable, a disruption, a point of unpredictability in a system that relied on control, which meant whatever was coming next would not be contained within polite speculation. It would surface, publicly, and when it did, it would not be subtle. The collapse began exactly where it had always been intended to, in public. Lady Norbury's grand winter ball was the final stage. Not because it was the most extravagant, though it was, but because it gathered precisely the people who had the most to lose. Families tied to Halvern influence, men who had already begun positioning themselves for advantage, observers who would ensure that whatever occurred within those walls would not remain there. She arrived late, not fashionably, strategically, every eye turned, not out of admiration, but expectation, because by then, the 30 days had nearly passed, and society, in its quiet cruelty, had already begun preparing for her failure. I did not stand beside her, not immediately. That too was deliberate, because what unfolded next did not require my protection. It required witness. The music had just begun when the first move revealed itself. Lord Everden, confident, composed, too composed. He approached her with the certainty of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. There was a brief exchange, polite, measured, and then, louder than necessary, "I trust, Miss Halvern, that you are prepared to honor your father's final condition." The room shifted, not abruptly, but collectively, because what he had done was not a question, it was a claim, and claims, when made publicly, demand resolution. She turned toward him, calm, unhurried. "I intend to honor far more than that, my lord." A ripple of curiosity, then the second move, documents, produced not by her, but by the solicitor, at her instruction. That was when the room stilled. Truly stilled. Because what followed was no longer speculation. It was exposure. The letters, the transfers, the quiet reassignments of authority that had taken place in the weeks before Lord Halvern's death. Not random, not administrative, targeted, directed, toward a single outcome. Control of the estate, diverted. Not to her, not entirely, but toward individuals who had, until that moment, remained comfortably invisible within the structure of her father's influence, and at the center of it, Lord Everden. The silence that followed was no longer polite, it was suffocating, because what had just been revealed was not merely ambition, it was orchestration, a man positioning himself to inherit not by marriage, but by manipulation, using the will as cover, using urgency as pressure, using her perceived weakness as opportunity, and she had allowed it. Every conversation, every assumption, every approach, she had let it unfold until it could no longer be denied. Lord Everden attempted composure, attempted dismissal, attempted to reclaim control through the only tool left to him, authority. This is misinterpretation, a weak defense, delivered too late. She did not argue, she did not accuse, she simply stepped aside and allowed the truth to stand where she had been, unshielded, unavoidable. That was when I moved, not to intervene, but to conclude. Misinterpretation, I said evenly, requires ambiguity. I looked at him, directly. There is none. The weight of the room shifted, not toward her, toward him, because in that moment, the narrative did what it always does when confronted with undeniable structure. It chose a side, and it was not his. Reputation does not collapse loudly, It erodes, rapidly, irreversibly. He understood it. I saw it in the stillness of his posture, in the absence of further argument, in the quiet retreat of those who had once aligned themselves too closely with him. And then, the final movement. She turned to me, not dramatically, not for display, but with the same certainty with which she had approached me in that ballroom. The condition has been met. A pause, deliberate, measured. I have chosen. No confusion remained, no speculation, no illusion left to maintain. This had never been about finding a husband. It had been about exposing a threat, and ensuring that when it surfaced, it would do so in a way that could not be contained. The room did not applaud, it did not react. It simply understood, and in that understanding, everything changed. In the days that followed, society did what it always does when confronted with something it failed to anticipate. It rewrote the story. Lord Everden's name did not vanish. It shifted, from certainty to caution, from influence to implication. Doors that once opened without question began to close with quiet finality, not dramatically, but decisively. And as for her, Eleanor Halvan was no longer invisible. She was no longer discussed as obligation or opportunity or quiet misfortune waiting to be resolved. She became something far more difficult to categorize, someone who had allowed society to underestimate her, and then used that underestimation as leverage. The estate remained hers, not by compliance, but by precision, every condition fulfilled, every manipulation exposed, every assumption dismantled. As for me, I did not regret my place in it. That, perhaps, was the most unexpected outcome of all, because what I had once dismissed as simplicity had revealed itself to be discipline. What I had mistaken for passivity was control, and what I had believed to be coincidence was design. We were married quietly, not as spectacle, not as resolution, but as continuation, because whatever had begun with her father's will had not ended with its unraveling. It had only changed form. If you have followed this account to its conclusion, I would be inclined to hear your judgment. Was she a strategist, or something far more dangerous still? And if such stories of quiet power and unseen design hold your interest, you may remain among those who listen closely. Because in our world, it is never the loudest move that changes everything. It is the one no one thought to question.